Judas Iscariot, the betrayal that changed faith forever. There are betrayals that end lives, and then there are betrayals that reshape civilizations. Judas Iscariot stands at the center of one such moment, where a single decision altered the course of human belief for centuries to come. Judas was not an outsider. He was one of the 12 disciples, chosen to walk alongside Jesus of Nazareth, to witness miracles, to hear teachings that spoke of compassion, humility, and a kingdom beyond earthly power. He shared meals, journeys, and quiet moments of faith. Trust surrounded him, yet somewhere within, that closeness doubt began to grow. The world around him was tense. Roman authority loomed over Judea, religious leaders feared losing control, and whispers of rebellion filled the streets. Jesus was not the revolutionary many expected. He did not call for war. He spoke of peace, and for someone like Judas, that may have felt like weakness, or perhaps a lost opportunity. Then came the decision that would echo through eternity. For 30 pieces of silver, Judas agreed to reveal Jesus' identity to those who sought to arrest him. It was not a battlefield betrayal. It was quiet, calculated, almost mundane. In the Garden of Gethsemane, under the cover of night, Judas approached Jesus and greeted him with a kiss. A gesture of loyalty turned into a mark of death. That moment did not just lead to an arrest. It led to a crucifixion, and that crucifixion became the foundation of Christianity, a faith that would spread across continents, shape empires, influence laws, and define cultures. The irony is impossible to ignore. Judas sought something: money, control, perhaps clarity, but what he created was far greater than anything he could have imagined. His betrayal did not silence a movement. It ignited one. In the end, Judas is remembered not just as a traitor, but as a symbol of human contradiction, a man who stood closest to truth and still chose to betray it. And through that choice, the spiritual map of the world was forever rewritten. Ephialtes of Trachis, the man who sold Sparta. Some betrayals are loud, filled with blood and chaos. Others are quiet. A single piece of information, given at the right time, capable of destroying an entire army. In 480 BCE, the narrow pass of Thermopylae became the stage for one of history's most legendary last stands. King Leonidas of Sparta, along with a small Greek force, stood against the vast army of Persian King Xerxes. The odds were impossible, yet the terrain gave the Greeks an advantage. The narrow pass neutralized the Persian numbers, turning the battle into a symbol of courage and resistance. For days, the Greeks held their ground. The Persian army, despite its size, could not break through. It seemed for a moment that discipline and strategy might overcome sheer force. But wars are not always decided by strength. Sometimes they are decided by betrayal. Ephialtes of Trachis was a local Greek who knew the land better than most. Hidden within the mountains was a narrow path that could lead the Persian army around the Greek defenses, allowing them to attack from behind. It was not common knowledge. It was not easily found. It required someone willing to reveal it. Ephialtes made that choice. Whether driven by greed, fear, or the promise of reward, he approached the Persians and disclosed the secret path. It was a simple act. No sword was raised. No blood was spilled in that moment. Yet, the consequences were devastating. Under the cover of night, Persian forces moved through the hidden route. By the time Leonidas realized what had happened, it was too late. The Greek forces were surrounded. The final stand at Thermopylae became legendary not because of victory, but because of sacrifice. Leonidas and his men fought to the death, knowing the outcome was inevitable. Their resistance became a symbol of courage, but it was Ephialtes' betrayal that made their defeat unavoidable. The irony lies in how history remembers them. Leonidas became immortalized as a hero. His stand inspired generations, shaping the identity of Western resistance against overwhelming odds. Ephialtes, on the other hand, became synonymous with treachery. His name endured not in honor, but in disgrace. Yet his impact cannot be ignored. By enabling the Persian advance, he shifted the balance of power in that moment, altering the course of the Greco-Persian Wars. A single act of betrayal turned the tide of a battle that defined civilizations. And it proved a brutal truth. Even the strongest defense can fall when someone inside chooses to open the door. Marcus Junius. Brutus, the knife that killed the Roman Republic. There are moments in history where power does not fall to enemies, but to friends standing closest. Rome, at its peak, was no stranger to ambition, betrayal, and blood. But nothing prepared it for the moment when loyalty itself became a weapon. Julius Caesar had risen beyond the limits of a republic. Victorious in war, Adored by the masses and feared by the elite, he stood on the edge of absolute power. To many, he was Rome's greatest leader. To others, he was its greatest threat. And standing between those two realities was Brutus, Marcus Junius. Brutus was not just a senator. He was a man bound to Caesar by trust, respect, and something deeper, almost familial loyalty. Caesar had forgiven him in the past, elevated him, trusted him. In a world driven by politics, Brutus was not expected to be the one holding the knife, but Rome was changing. The Senate feared that Caesar intended to crown himself king, ending centuries of republican tradition. Whispers turned into conspiracies. Conspiracies turned into decisions. And Brutus, torn between loyalty to a man and loyalty to an idea, made a choice that would echo through history. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Caesar walked into the Senate, unaware that he was stepping into his final moments. The conspirators surrounded him. At first, it seemed like confusion. Then steel flashed. Blades struck from every direction. Caesar resisted, fought, tried to understand what was happening, until he saw Brutus among them. In that instant, something shifted. It was no longer just an attack. It was betrayal. The words attributed to him, whether spoken or not, captured the weight of that moment. Not anger, not fear, but disbelief. The realization that the man he trusted was part of the end. Et tu, Brute. And just like that, the most powerful man in Rome fell at the feet of those who claimed to save it. But the irony of Brutus's decision is what makes his betrayal one of the most brutal in history. He believed he was saving the Republic. Instead, he destroyed it. Caesar's death did not restore balance. It created chaos. Civil war erupted. Power struggles intensified. And from the ashes of the Republic rose something far more absolute, the Roman Empire. Octavian, later known as Augustus, would become its first emperor. Brutus, the man who sought to preserve freedom, became the architect of its end. In the end, he lost everything. Defeated in war, abandoned by the cause he fought for, Brutus took his own life, falling on his sword. His legacy remains one of history's most haunting contradictions. A man who loved Rome, a man who betrayed a friend, and a man whose single decision changed the destiny of an empire forever. Mir Jafar, the betrayal that handed India to the British. Some betrayals do not just end. Battles. They begin centuries of domination. In 1757, the plains of Plassey became the turning point of an entire subcontinent's fate. The British East India Company, still a trading entity at the time, stood against the forces of Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. On paper, it was not even a fair fight. The Nawab commanded a vastly larger army, superior resources, and control over one of the richest regions in the world. Victory should have been inevitable. But history does not always follow logic. Within Siraj-ud-Dowlah's own ranks stood a man whose ambition outweighed his loyalty. Mir Jafar, a senior commander, had already begun secret negotiations with the British. Promised power, wealth, and the throne of Bengal, he made a decision that would alter the future of millions. When the battle began, something felt wrong. Troops that should have advanced stood still. Commands that should have been followed were ignored. Siraj-ud-Dowlah watched as large portions of his army remained inactive, paralyzed not by fear, but by betrayal. Mir Jafar, along with other conspirators, had chosen not to fight. The outcome was swift. With minimal resistance, the British secured victory. A battle that should have crushed them instead became their greatest opportunity. And at the center of it all stood Mir Jafar, who was soon placed on the throne as a puppet ruler. But this was not just a personal betrayal. It was the beginning of colonial rule in India. Plassey opened the gates for the British East India Company to expand its control, not just in Bengal, but across the entire subcontinent. What started as trade transformed into domination. Wealth was extracted. Economies were reshaped. Millions would eventually live under foreign rule for nearly 2 centuries. Mir Jafar got what he wanted, power, but it came with a cost. He was never truly in control. The British dictated decisions, controlled resources, and reduced him to a figurehead. His name became synonymous with treachery, a symbol of how ambition can blind a man to the consequences of his actions. The tragedy of Mir Jafar lies not just in what he did, but in what he enabled. He did not simply betray a ruler, he betrayed a nation's future. And through that single decision, the map of the world shifted, placing India under one of the most powerful empires in history. Benedict Arnold, the hero who turned against his own cause. Some betrayals are born not from greed, but from wounded pride. Benedict Arnold was once a hero of the American Revolution. He fought bravely, led critical victories, and earned respect on the battlefield. But respect in war does not always translate into recognition in politics. While others received promotions and praise, Arnold felt overlooked, insulted, and increasingly bitter. That bitterness slowly transformed into something dangerous. By 1780, Arnold had begun secret negotiations with the British. His plan was simple, yet devastating. He would surrender West Point, one of the most important American fortresses, in exchange for money and a high-ranking position in the British Army. It was not just a military betrayal, it was a strategic one that could have crushed the American rebellion entirely. But fate intervened. The British officer carrying Arnold's plans was captured, exposing the entire plot. Arnold fled before he could be arrested, escaping to British lines and leaving behind a reputation that would never recover. He received what he wanted: rank, money, safety. But he lost something far greater. His name became synonymous with betrayal in American history. Even today, calling someone a Benedict Arnold is to call them a traitor. The irony is sharp. A man who once fought for freedom became one of its greatest enemies. And while his betrayal failed, it hardened American resolve, reminding a young nation that the greatest threats often come from within. Wang Jingwei, the leader who chose the enemy. Not all betrayals happen in secret. Some are made openly, justified as necessity. Wang Jingwei was once a prominent figure in China's revolutionary movement, a close associate of Sun Yat-sen, and a man seen as a future leader. But when Japan invaded China in the 1930s, the country faced destruction on an unimaginable scale. Cities burned, civilians suffered. Resistance came at a brutal cost. In the midst of this chaos, Wang made a decision that would define his legacy. He chose collaboration. Believing that continued resistance would only lead to more suffering, Wang aligned himself with Imperial Japan and established a puppet government under their control. He presented it as a path to peace, a way to stabilize the country, and avoid further bloodshed. But, to millions, it was something else entirely. It was surrender. While Chinese forces continued to fight and resist occupation, Wang's government became a symbol of submission, seen as aiding the enemy rather than protecting the nation. His justification did not erase the reality. His actions strengthened Japanese control during one of China's darkest periods. The consequences were lasting. His name became a symbol of treachery, not pragmatism. A man who once fought for China's future became remembered as someone who compromised. The tragedy of Wang Jingwei lies in the ambiguity. Was he trying to save lives or save himself? History answered in only one way. He was remembered not as a leader, but as a traitor who stood with the enemy while his country burned. Philippe Pétain, the hero who became a puppet. Some betrayals are not born from ambition, but from fear disguised as wisdom. Philippe Pétain was once a hero of France. In World War I, he was celebrated as the defender of Verdun, a symbol of resilience against impossible odds. The nation trusted him. They believed he was the man who could protect France again. But by 1940, France was collapsing under the weight of Nazi Germany's rapid advance. Defeat felt inevitable. Faced with destruction, Pétain made a decision that would redefine his legacy. Instead of continuing the fight, he chose to surrender and lead what became known as Vichy France, a regime that collaborated with Nazi Germany. He called it preservation. He claimed it would spare France from greater suffering, but the cost was heavy. Under his rule, French authorities cooperated with Nazi policies, including the persecution and deportation of Jews. Resistance fighters were suppressed. The nation was divided, not just geographically, but morally. Pétain believed he was saving France. History remembers him as a man who compromised. After the war, he was tried for treason. The same country that once praised him now condemned him. His earlier heroism could not erase what came later. The irony is devastating. A man who once stood as France's shield became the face of its surrender. Vidkun Quisling, the name that became betrayal. Some names fade into history, others become warnings. Vidkun Quisling was a Norwegian politician who saw opportunity in chaos. When Nazi Germany invaded Norway in 1940, he did not resist. Instead, he stepped forward and declared himself the leader of a new government, one aligned entirely with the occupiers. It was not a secret deal. It was a public betrayal. Quisling believed he could rule under German support, gaining power while his country fell under foreign control. But his authority was hollow. Real power remained in Nazi hands, while he served as a symbol, a local face to legitimize occupation. To the people of Norway, he was not a leader. He was a collaborator. Resistance movements grew. Underground networks formed. And while Norway endured occupation, Quisling's name became something darker than just a man. It became a definition. Across the world, Quisling entered language as a synonym for traitor. After the war, his fate was sealed. He was arrested, tried, and executed. There was no redemption, no reinterpretation, only judgment. The legacy he left behind was not power, not leadership, not ideology. It was a word that would forever mean betrayal. Andrei Vlasov, the general who turned against his own army. Some betrayals are not immediate. They are born in captivity, shaped by despair, and sealed by survival. Andrei Vlasov was a respected Soviet general during World War II, a man trusted to defend his country against the Nazi invasion. He fought fiercely in the early stages of the war, earning recognition for his leadership. But war has a way of breaking even the strongest men. In 1942, Vlasov was captured by German forces. What followed was not just imprisonment, but transformation. Faced with harsh conditions, uncertainty, and perhaps disillusionment with Stalin's regime, Vlasov made a decision few could imagine. He agreed to cooperate with the enemy, not just quietly, but openly. He formed the Russian Liberation Army, a force composed of Soviet prisoners who chose to fight alongside Nazi Germany against their own homeland. To him, it may have seemed like a chance to fight a different enemy, Stalin's system. To the Soviet Union, it was pure betrayal. His actions carried both symbolic and psychological weight. A general switching sides was more than a military loss. It was a crack in morale, a reminder that even trusted leaders could turn. But the irony followed him to the end. As the war shifted and Germany began to collapse, Vlasov's position became fragile. There was no victory waiting for him, no safe ground to stand on. When the war ended, he was captured. Not by the Germans, but by the Soviets. This time, there was no escape. He was tried for treason and executed in 1946. Vlasov's story remains one of the most complex betrayals in history. A man caught between survival, ideology, and desperation, who chose a path that erased everything he once stood for. Robert Hansen, the man who sold secrets from within. Some betrayals are not seen on battlefields. They unfold in silence, behind desks, inside offices, hidden within systems built on trust. Robert Hansen was an FBI agent, a man whose entire career revolved around protecting the United States from espionage. He had access to some of the most sensitive intelligence in the country. He knew how spies operated. He understood how they were caught. And for over 2 decades, he became one. Beginning in the late 1970s, Hansen secretly passed classified information to the Soviet Union and later Russia. He did not act out of ideology. There was no grand political cause behind his actions. There was only money and control. He operated carefully, methodically, never drawing attention. He used dead drops, coded messages, and layers of secrecy that made him nearly invisible within the very system designed to detect people like him. The damage was immense. Dozens of intelligence operations were compromised. American assets were exposed. Some were arrested. Some were executed. Trust within the intelligence community fractured, not because of an external enemy, but because of someone inside. Hansen's betrayal was not loud. It was quiet, continuous, and devastating. For years, he lived a normal life, going to work, interacting with colleagues, appearing ordinary. That was his greatest weapon. He did not look like a traitor. He looked like everyone else. In 2001, after decades of espionage, he was finally arrested. Not through dramatic pursuit, but through careful investigation that uncovered the pattern he believed was invisible. He was sentenced to life in prison. The irony of Robert Hansen is chilling. A man tasked with defending secrets became one of the greatest threats to them, and his story stands as a reminder that the most dangerous betrayals are not always those we see coming, but those hiding quietly in plain sight. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the man who served every side. Some betrayals are not sudden. They are calculated, repeated, and perfected over time. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand was not a soldier, not a rebel, not a man driven by emotion. He was something far more dangerous, a master of survival in a world where power changed hands through revolution, blood, and ambition. He lived through one of the most unstable periods in French history, the fall of the monarchy, the rise of the revolution, the chaos of Napoleon, and the restoration of the crown. And through all of it, he remained, not loyal, not fixed, but always present. Talleyrand served the monarchy, then supported the revolutionaries. He worked with Napoleon, then secretly undermined him. When Napoleon began to fall, Talleyrand had already shifted his allegiance, aligning himself with those who would shape the future of Europe. To some, he was a genius diplomat. To others, he was betrayal itself in human form. His influence reached beyond France. At the Congress of Vienna, he played a crucial role in reshaping Europe after Napoleon's defeat. Borders were redrawn, power was redistributed. The map of the continent changed, not through war alone, but through negotiation, manipulation, and calculated loyalty. But his legacy carries a haunting question. Was he serving France, or only himself? Talleyrand never fell, never paid the price that many traitors did. Instead, he thrived in instability, adapting to every shift in power. His betrayal was not a single act, it was a strategy. And through that strategy, he helped shape the political landscape of modern Europe. The partition informants, the betrayals, that divided a subcontinent. Some betrayals are not tied to one man. They are scattered, hidden, multiplied across millions of lives. In 1947, the British Empire prepared to leave the Indian subcontinent. What followed was not a smooth transition, but a violent division. India and Pakistan carved out of a land that had existed as one for centuries. Lines were drawn on maps, but those lines cut through homes, families, and identities. Amid the chaos, trust began to collapse. Neighbors turned against neighbors. Information was traded in whispers. Communities that had lived side by side for generations suddenly found themselves divided by fear, religion, and uncertainty. There were informants, people who revealed hiding places, exposed movements, and pointed out targets, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of revenge, sometimes simply to survive. Violence spread rapidly. Mass migrations began, with millions forced to leave their homes. Trains arrived filled not with passengers, but with silence. Entire villages disappeared overnight. The scale of human suffering was unimaginable, but behind the visible chaos, there were countless unseen betrayals. Small decisions that led to large consequences. A name revealed, a location exposed, a warning withheld. These were not acts recorded in official documents or remembered through famous names. Yet, their impact was profound. They intensified the violence, accelerated the collapse of trust, and turned a political division into one of the largest human tragedies in history. The creation of India and Pakistan redrew the map of the world, but it was not just leaders or borders that defined that moment. It was the breakdown of human connection, where survival often came at the cost of loyalty. The tragedy of partition is not only in the lines that were drawn, but in the countless invisible betrayals that made those lines bleed. Aldrich Ames, the mole who destroyed his own side. Some betrayals don't just shift power, they silently erase lives. Aldrich Ames was a CIA officer entrusted with protecting American intelligence operations during the Cold War. He knew the names, the networks, the secrets that operated in the shadows of global conflict. He understood how fragile those systems were and exactly how to break them. In the mid-1980s, Ames made a decision that would devastate the intelligence world. He began selling secrets to the Soviet Union. It wasn't ideology, it wasn't patriotism, it was money. A quiet transaction that turned one man into one of the most destructive spies in American history. But unlike battlefield betrayals, this one unfolded slowly. Names were passed, identities revealed, operations exposed. And then, one by one, agents began to disappear. Some were arrested, others were executed. Entire networks collapsed without warning. Inside the CIA, confusion turned into fear. No one understood how the Soviets seemed to know everything. The truth was far worse. The enemy wasn't outside, it was already inside. For nearly a decade, Ames continued his work, living comfortably, unnoticed, while the damage grew. He watched as investigations failed, as suspicion moved in the wrong directions, as lives were lost because of information only he had provided. When he was finally arrested in 1994, the scale of his betrayal became clear. He had compromised dozens of agents, many of whom paid with their lives. Ames did not just betray a country, he betrayed individuals, people who trusted a system that he quietly dismantled from within. And in the end, his story revealed a brutal truth. The most dangerous betrayals are not loud, dramatic, or immediate. They are patient, calculated, and invisible until it's too late. Oleg Gordievsky, the spy who turned against his own empire. Not every betrayal is driven by greed. Some are born from belief from the slow realization that loyalty itself may be misplaced. Oleg Gordievsky was a high-ranking officer in the KGB, the Soviet Union's intelligence agency. He was trained to serve the state, to defend it, to believe in its power. For years, he did exactly that. But something changed. As he witnessed the inner workings of the system, the paranoia, the control, the suppression, his faith began to fracture. The ideology he once served started to feel less like protection and more like imprisonment. And so, he made a decision that carried enormous risk. He became a double agent for British intelligence. Unlike others, Gordievsky did not act for money. He acted out of conviction, believing that the Soviet system needed to be challenged from within. For years, he passed critical information to the West, offering insight into Soviet strategies, intentions, and fears. His intelligence played a key role during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War, helping prevent misunderstandings that could have escalated into nuclear conflict. But betrayal always carries consequences. Eventually, suspicion reached him. The system he once served began to close in. Every move became dangerous. Every moment carried the risk of exposure. In 1985, Gordievsky was forced to escape in a dramatic operation, smuggled out of the Soviet Union under the watch of the very agency he had betrayed. Unlike many traitors, he survived. But his story leaves behind a complicated question. Was he a traitor or a protector? To the Soviet Union, he was a defector. To the West, he was a hero. And in that contrast lies the complexity of betrayal itself. Because sometimes, the line between treason and truth is not as clear as history makes it seem. The Arab Revolt betrayal promises that redrew the Middle East. Some betrayals are not between individuals, they are between nations, wrapped in promises that were never meant to be kept. During World War I, the Middle East became a battlefield not just of armies, but of agreements made in secret. The British Empire, seeking to weaken the Ottoman Empire, reached out to Arab leaders with a powerful promise. Support us, revolt against the Ottomans, and in return, you will have independence. It was a promise of freedom, and it worked. Arab forces, inspired by the idea of self-rule, rose against Ottoman control. Leaders believed they were shaping their own future, fighting not just for victory, but for sovereignty. The revolt gained momentum, supported by British officers like T. Lawrence, who helped coordinate efforts on the ground. But behind those promises, another plan was already unfolding. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, a secret deal between Britain and France that divided the Middle East into spheres of influence long before the war even ended. Borders were drawn not based on culture, identity, or history, but on strategic interests. When the war ended, the truth emerged. There was no independent Arab state as promised. Instead, the region was carved into mandates controlled by European powers: Syria, Iraq, Palestine, lines drawn across maps that would shape decades of conflict, instability, and tension. The betrayal was not immediate, but its consequences were lasting. It created nations without unity, borders without agreement, and conflicts that would echo through generations. The Middle East, as we know it today, is deeply tied to that moment, when trust was traded for strategy. The tragedy lies in its scale. It was not just a leader betrayed, it was an entire region. And through that deception, the world map was redrawn, not by those who lived there, but by those who promised them freedom.